Well, of course, we also had a response from Stellenbosch University that says it's hoping to finalize the probe into the racism incident in the next few days. Vice-Chancellor Professor Wim de Villiers says the perpetrator faces the possibility of being permanently expelled from the institution. In a short video released today, de Villiers assures students and staff that the incident is being prioritized.
Stellenbosch University strongly condemns any destructive or discriminatory behavior that infringes upon the rights of any student or member of the community of the university. Human dignity is non-negotiable and must be respected, upheld, and restored when affected. I also personally strongly condemn the destructive, hurtful, and racist incident that was captured on a cell phone video in the Huis Marais residence on the Stellenbosch University campus in the early hours of Sunday morning. The student captured on the video was already suspended from the university on Monday morning and excluded from Huis Marais. This suspension will remain in place until the investigation that is currently underway is completed. It is critical that thorough governance and procedures are followed for a decisive outcome that will allow for the full extent of the law, as well as compliance with the university's governance regulations.
Well, for more on the story, we're joined by social justice activist Busi Seabe and activist and author Zulaikha Patel. Good evening to both of you. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Firstly, let me just begin by asking, what your individual responses or reactions are to this video. Busi, let me begin with you. What did you think after you first saw what happened?
Good evening, and thank you very much for having me. My sincerest apologies for lighting. ESCOM has arrived and done what it does best. But my reaction to the video, outside of being generally just fatigued, it was not something that was unexpected. I think when you think about, the University of Stellenbosch, and you think about a lot of, previous cases, a lot of previous incidents that have happened at that particular institution of higher learning, you'll find that, racially motivated or racially fueled kind of, incidents are very prominent in that institution. I was definitely disgusted by the actions of, de Doit, the student who, was urinating. But more than anything, I particularly understand, the reaction from, social media, from society and the public, in the sense that 28 years into democracy, we're still being met with racism, we're still being met with, the kind of disregard for our human rights as Black African people in this country.
Zulaikha? All right, it looks like we've lost Zulaikha Patel. They were not having a great connection with her. But Busi, let me continue with you. Many people, of course, have been saying all sorts of different things about what we saw in that video. But I think most concerning is, of course, this idea about a culture that has been created at Stellenbosch University that over the years seems to struggle where transformation is concerned. And therefore, the environment there continues to enable this kind of behavior.
Definitely. I think the culture of racism is deeply embedded in that institution. Let's not forget that the architect of apartheid, for an example, was a professor at Stellenbosch University. So if racism is going to show up with vile audacity, Stellenbosch is the obvious venue. But more than anything, I think the barbaric act of urinating in another student's room and on his possessions is grossly demeaning and goes far beyond a physical attack on, personal property. The intention was to completely demean and dehumanize a Black student and to question his legitimate right to study at this public university. So incidents like these are very prominent at Stellenbosch University. Let's go back 8 years ago, right? So there was a viral racism video of the posters of an Anglo-Afrikaner event, were posted all over campus with propaganda images, right? In 2019, the residence head, was calling students using the K word across, residences at Stellenbosch. Another incident that happened was, the blackface scandal at the University of Stellenbosch. So that begins to tell you that there hasn't been a lot of transformation within that particular institution of higher learning. And this is particularly the right time for us to introspect on, the transformation policies at that particular institution, and to begin to interrogate to what extent is the transformation project truly fully underway and making progress at the university, or is this a sign of an institution and an institutional culture that remains largely untransformed? And this is not just the problem at the University of Stellenbosch. Racism is an issue in the Western Cape, in South Africa, on the continent in its entirety. And this gives you a sort of an idea of what, society is like, right? So when you go into an institution of higher learning, you hear that institutions of higher learning are microcosms of society. So what you find in institutions, you're likely to find happening out in broader society. And the racism that, African and black, and by black I mean, Biko black, including colored Indian and other non-white races, face at institutions of higher learning is the same kind of racism that we are, subjected to in corporate, in, different kinds of avenues and spaces in broader society outside of institutions of higher learning. This goes to show you that there hasn't been any decolonization, any transformation, or any, steps towards, this rainbow nation that, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, and Beyers Naudé fought so hard for. You begin to understand that what we see to be our reality is not necessarily what is, when you note the kind of things that young people, especially people who are born after 1994, are being subjected to in this country.
I believe Zulaikha is back on the line. Zulaikha, let me bring you into the conversation here. An opportunity for you to weigh in terms of, your reaction when you saw this video, and what do you read about what it tells us about the state of affairs at Stellenbosch University.
Very good evening to you. Thank you very much for having me. So upon me seeing the video, I was absolutely revolted and absolutely disgusted. But however, I would say I wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised given the fact that Stellenbosch has for years now, it's been allowed to exist as an institution that has become breeding grounds for racism. It exists with racism within the institution, and that has been normalized and allowed for years, right? So I wasn't surprised. And I also further wasn't surprised given the current state of affairs in our country. Current state of affairs in our country is that we have had for years an issue with addressing and coming to direct terms with the issue of racism in our country, institutionalized racism in our country, right? And coming to terms with the fact that racism was not buried in 1994 and is even more prevalent in your former white institutions of learning in the country, right? However, other feelings that I felt upon seeing the video was, I had to think deeply about the fact that whether there would be accountability this time around, given the fact that historically, if we trace back into our country's history, we don't have a history of accountability. And also, looking at my personal experiences, what happens is when there's an incident of racism in an institution, investigations are conducted whilst the perpetrator, there's so much of the perpetrator whereby we're not taking harsh accountability against the perpetrator, and we have so much sensitivity for the perpetrator, right? And psychologically, we also have that sensitivity where we question whether we should even be taking accountability or that much accountability against this person, right? And so I had to question whether we'd even take accountability against this person, because black students in Stellenbosch have been unheard for many years, haven't had any justice and accountability towards incidents of racism, which they've constantly over the years expressed in the media, expressed to the management of the institution. And looking at our financial power and economic power, essentially the power, the decision-making power in this country, has not lied in the hands of the black majority for years. And that results in us not having built accountability systems to take accountability against perpetrators of racism, because what that student did to the black student was absolutely inhumane, dehumanizing, and is something that shouldn't be shoved under the rug, as incidents have constantly been shoved under the rug. This is something that was absolutely dehumanizing and was in fact an act of terrorism against the black student.
Busi, the university's management has been, talking a lot about their transformation plans, and they've talked about how in the last couple of years they believe that they've really made progress, including being able to rid, a lot of their residents of initiation practices that were part, again, of the culture. What more do you think the university can and should be doing?
I think the university definitely needs to relook its transformation policies. It definitely needs to, employ some critical diversity and transformation lessons on all students. But more than anything, I think a very important thing that we might not even be looking at this particular point in time is the psychology of the Afrikaans white community and our, and by our I mean black Africans, subsequent and consequent immersion in the world that, the Afrikaans white community has created for itself in institutions of higher learning, right? When you look at patriarchy, when you look at faith, when you look at, education, when you look at access to institutions of higher learning, we need to be able to look and to be able to begin to understand the psychology of the different racial groupings that are coming into institutions of higher learning. And this is something that Stellenbosch needs to be able to do as an institution as well, not only to safeguard itself, but also to prepare, a proper environment for young people to be able to academically succeed in their institution, and that's not something that they're doing. When you also look at a lot of the research that, comes out of Stellenbosch University, you'll also note that a lot of its research, is very racially motivated and has undertones of racism in itself. So now we need to start looking at the management of the university. We need to start looking at the principles that define the transformation office. We need to be able to understand whether, the institution itself has any critical diversity, lenses through which and principles through which it imparts and engages with people, of different races. We need to be able to decolonize to a large extent our institutions of higher learning in addition to decolonizing our curriculum. And I think this is one of the things that Fees Must Fall attempted to articulate so well, to say that our institutions of higher learning have rendered black, particularly African students, have put them in a place where we cannot breathe, right? So we fight to get access into institutions of higher learning. We fight to remain in those institutions. We fight to, stop being financially excluded or academically excluded, only for us to be violated, only for us to be dehumanized, only for our rights to, just be squandered at the hands of a minority that believes that they own, to a large extent, everyone else in the country. And it could be true because of the arrogance that them having land has given them, to the extent that they believe that they are able to do certain things and not face the consequences or repercussions of it. I think when we think about the Stellenbosch incident, we can never forget what happened with the University of Free State Reeds incident, where, our mothers, our sisters were forced to consume food that had been urinated in. This is a tradition in predominantly Afrikaans white community institutions of higher learning. If it's not the Free State, we'll have a similar incident at the University of Pretoria. If it's not there, it's Stellenbosch. If it's not there, it's another, predominantly Afrikaans white community institution.
All
and
right.
These are the little nuances we need to start looking into and dispelling.
Zulaikha, let me end it off with you. As somebody who's had to grapple, with being on the receiving end of overt racism, what's the hardest step after going through such an experience?
You know what I think the hardest step is, and this is going to be more from personal experience, right? I believe that there's never enough sensitivity around the victim that has experienced the incident. There's not enough sensitivity, and there's no means of any psychological support provided to the victim, because then again, we do have a history in the country of not taking Black mental health seriously and not seeing Black pain as something that is serious, right? And so not enough psychological support is provided. And then again, the victim will continue to experience victimization at the hands of not just the institution, but at the hands of white management as well. And in general, being the Black student in the experience on the receiving end in the incident of racism, you ultimately experience more violation post the incident through victimization, because even in institutions of higher learning, Black students have always received harsher consequences, right? And so then again, you find yourself sitting in the same lecture hall with the person that perpetrated this act of terrorism on you, and you have not received any form of justice, and you sit there with them whilst they continue to humiliate you, and whilst they continue to enjoy the privileges of being white and being a privileged person in the country, and whilst you remain on the receiving end with no sensitivity, no psychological support, and no support from the institution as well, right? And for me, I think one thing that would be extremely disappointing with this incident in particular is if there is no harsh action taken against the perpetrator being detoyed, right? I believe that he should be not just suspended, but expelled, and he should face academic exclusion from all institutions of the country, because it is not fair and it is quite an injustice that when Black women protest against rape culture in institutions like Rhodes, they face academic exclusion. They're unable to obtain their degrees simply for protesting for their own rights. But then again, when a white student violates a Black student, they merely just get a slap on their hand and they're told not to do it again, and then they're welcomed back into the institution like nothing happened. Right. And that's why I believe that he should be expelled from all institutions of higher learning in the country and should face criminal charges, because this is an act of terrorism. Right. Peeing on someone's property is an act of terrorism, and it should not be taken lightly.
Zulaikha Patel, let's leave it there. Busi Seabe, both activists in their own right.